Before tonight's tale begins, answer me this. If you looked in a mirror and it told you that someone else was more beautiful than you, would you accept it gracefully or let jealousy consume you? Comment, accept, or consumed right now. Because tonight's story is about a queen who asked a mirror a question she should never have asked. A princess whose beauty became a death sentence. And the terrible price of vanity. This is Snow White, not the Disney version, but the true Brothers Grimm tale of beauty, poison, jealousy, and a sleep that looks like death. Close your eyes, settle in, and let me take you to a time when mirrors spoke truth. Beauty could kill, jealousy wore a crown, and sometimes the fairest in the land paid for it with her life. Once upon a time, in the depths of winter, when snow fell like feathers from the sky, and the world was dressed in white, a queen sat sewing by a window. The window frame was made of ebony, black as night. And as she sewed, she looked out at the snowflakes drifting down. She was not a vain woman, this first queen. She was kind and gentle, beloved by her people. But like many queens of her time, she had one great sorrow. She had no child. She and the king had been married for many years, and their chambers remained empty of the laughter of children. As she sewed and watched the snow, she pricked her finger with the needle. 3 drops of blood fell onto the snow beside the window, and the sight of that red blood on white snow against the black ebony frame stirred something in her heart. She made a wish. "I wish," she whispered, "that I might have a daughter with skin as white as snow, lip as red as blood, and hair as black as ebony wood." It was a strange wish, perhaps, not to wish for health or happiness or wisdom for her child, but for beauty. But beauty in those days was seen as a blessing from the divine, a sign of inner goodness. And the queen, in her innocence, believed that a beautiful child would be a blessed child, and her wish was granted. Not long after, the queen discovered she was with child. The king was overjoyed. The kingdom celebrated. And when the baby was born, a daughter, perfect and healthy, the queen looked at her and saw that her wish had come true exactly as she'd spoken it. The child had skin as white as snow, lips as red as blood, and hair as black as ebony. "Snow White?" the queen whispered, holding her daughter for the first time. "I shall call you Snow White." But wishes, even innocent ones, have a way of bringing unexpected consequences. The queen held her daughter only a few times before falling ill. Childbirth in those days was dangerous, and not all women survived it. Within a week of Snow White's birth, the first queen died, leaving behind a grieving king and a motherless infant daughter. The king mourned deeply. For a full year, he wore black and would not entertain any talk of remarrying. He devoted himself to his infant daughter, and Snow White grew from a baby into a toddler under her father's loving care. But a king cannot rule alone forever, and a kingdom needs a queen. His advisors pressed him. His nobles encouraged him. And eventually, he agreed that he would remarry, not for love, but for duty. The woman he chose was beautiful, extraordinarily beautiful. Some said she was the most beautiful woman in the entire kingdom. She was also intelligent, well-educated, and knew how to conduct herself in court. On paper, she was the perfect choice. But there were rumors about her, whispered stories that she had studied the dark arts, that she had powers beyond those of ordinary women. Some said she had a magic mirror that could show her anything she wished to see. Others said she had used enchantments to make the king notice her. But the king was lonely, and she was beautiful, and he chose not to listen to rumors. So they married, and the beautiful woman became queen. At first, the new queen seemed kind enough to little Snow White. She did not love the child. That much was clear. But she was civil. She saw to it that Snow White had nurses and tutors, that she was fed and clothed appropriately for a princess. But as Snow White grew from a toddler into a child, and from a child into a young girl, something began to change in the queen, because Snow White was becoming beautiful, more than beautiful. She was becoming extraordinary. Her skin truly was as white as snow, flawless and pure. Her lips were naturally the color of ripe cherries, and her hair, black as a raven's wing, framed a face of such sweetness and innocence that people stopped to stare when she walked by. And the queen, who had always prided herself on being the most beautiful woman in the kingdom, began to notice how people looked at Snow White, began to notice how they smiled when the princess entered a room, began to notice that when Snow White stood beside her, sometimes, just sometimes, people looked at the girl first, and the queen second. The queen had a magic mirror. This much was true. It hung in her private chambers, a tall mirror with an ornate gold frame, and it had been given to her by someone who practiced the old magic. Perhaps her mother, perhaps a teacher, perhaps a darker source. No one knew for certain. Every morning, the queen would stand before this mirror and ask it a question. The same question every single morning. Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all? And every morning, the mirror would reply in its strange, echoing voice, "You, O Queen, are the fairest of all." This answer pleased the Queen greatly. It confirmed what she needed to believe, that she was supreme in beauty, that no one could rival her, that her worth, for she measured her worth in beauty, was secure. But mirrors, especially magic ones, do not lie. They may avoid the truth, they may speak in riddles, but they cannot speak a direct falsehood. The mirror told the Queen she was the fairest because, at that time, it was true. But truth changes, and the day came when the mirror's answer changed too. Snow White was 7 years old when the mirror first gave a different answer. 7 years old, still a child, innocent and sweet-natured. She loved her father, tried to please her stepmother, and spent her days learning the things a princess must learn: reading and writing, embroidery and music, history and languages. She was extraordinarily kind to everyone, to servants and nobles alike. She had inherited her mother's gentle nature, and despite growing up with a stepmother who was cold to her, Snow White remained warm-hearted and loving, and she was becoming breathtakingly beautiful. On the morning that everything changed, the Queen stood before her mirror as always. She had dressed carefully in her finest gown, had her hair arranged perfectly, had applied subtle cosmetics to enhance her already striking features. She asked the question she had asked 1,000 times before. Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all? She expected the usual answer. She was prepared to preen a bit, to admire herself in the mirror's surface, to carry that confirmation of her beauty with her throughout the day. But the mirror's answer was different. You, O Queen, are fair. 'Tis true, but Snow White is 1,000 times fairer than you. The Queen stood frozen. For a long moment, she couldn't breathe. She stared at her reflection, at the beautiful woman looking back at her, and felt something cold and terrible spreading through her chest. "What did you say?" she whispered. The mirror repeated, patient and merciless. You, O Queen, are fair. 'Tis true, but Snow White is 1,000 times fairer than you. The Queen's hands clenched into fists. Her face, usually so carefully composed, twisted with rage and something deeper. Fear. Fear that if she was not the fairest, then she had no value. Fear that she would be cast aside. Fear that everything she had built her identity upon was crumbling. "She's a child," the queen said to her reflection. "A 7-year-old child." But the mirror said nothing more. It had spoken its truth. From that moment on, the queen could not look at Snow White without feeling that cold rage building inside her. Every time she saw the girl's innocent face, her white skin, her red lips, her black hair, the queen felt as though something was being stolen from her. The queen began to avoid Snow White. She could not bear to be in the same room with her. And when she did see her, she looked at the child with such hatred that Snow White, young as she was, began to fear her stepmother, though she didn't understand why. The queen asked the mirror the same question every morning, and every morning received the same answer. Snow White was fairer. And every day, the queen's hatred grew. She began to lose sleep. She would lie awake at night, thinking about Snow White, about the girl's beauty, about how it was increasing while her own, though still considerable, was subject to the inevitable effects of time. The queen was perhaps 30 years old, still young, still beautiful. But Snow White was 7, and her beauty was just beginning. And the thought that drove the queen to madness was this: if Snow White is fairer than me now, what will she be like at 15? At 20? The queen's hatred turned into obsession. She could think of nothing else. Her kingdom, her duties, her husband faded into irrelevance. There was only the mirror and its terrible truth, and the child who had stolen her position as the fairest of all. Finally, the queen decided that Snow White had to die. It wasn't a sudden decision, but a slow corruption of her soul, a gradual descent from vanity to murderous jealousy. But once she had decided, once she had let that thought take root, it grew quickly into a terrible resolve. She could not kill Snow White herself. A queen could not be seen murdering her stepdaughter. It would be too obvious, too scandalous, but there were other ways. The queen summoned one of her huntsmen, a man who had served the royal family for many years, a skilled tracker and hunter, and importantly, a man who could be bought. "I have a task for you," the queen said, her voice cold and commanding. "A task that requires both skill and secrecy. Can you be trusted?" The huntsman bowed. "Of course, Your Majesty." "Good." The queen's eyes glittered like ice. "I want you to take Princess Snow White into the forest. Deep into the forest, far from the castle. And there, you will kill her." The huntsman's head shot up, his face pale with shock. "Your Majesty, she is a threat to me. the queen interrupted. "I want her dead. And to prove to me that you have done as I command, you will bring me her lungs and liver. Do this, and you will be rewarded handsomely. Refuse, and..." She let the threat hang unspoken in the air. The huntsman looked at the queen's face and saw no mercy there, no humanity. He saw only cold determination and barely contained madness. "Yes, Your Majesty," he said quietly. "It will be done." The next day, the huntsman went to Snow White and told her that the queen wished her to go on an outing into the forest to see the spring flowers. Snow White, who rarely left the castle grounds, was delighted. She trusted the huntsman, who had always been kind to her, and she put on her cloak and went with him willingly. They walked deep into the forest, far beyond where Snow White had ever been. The trees here were ancient and tall, their branches blocking out much of the sunlight. The path, such as it was barely visible. This was the deep forest, where few people ventured. Snow White, innocent as she was, chattered happily as they walked, pointing out flowers and birds, delighting in the adventure. The huntsman said little, and his face grew more and more troubled with each step. Finally, they reached a place so deep in the forest that no sound of civilization reached them. Just the wind in the trees, the calls of distant birds, the rustling of small creatures in the undergrowth. The huntsman stopped walking. "We'll rest here," he said, his voice rough. Snow White sat on a fallen log, still smiling. "It's so beautiful here. I've never been this far into the forest before. Thank you for bringing me." The huntsman drew his knife. Snow White saw the blade, and her smile faltered. What are you doing?" The huntsman looked at her, at this innocent 7-year-old child with her trusting eyes and sweet face, and something broke inside him. He had hunted animals his entire life, had killed deer and boar and wolves without hesitation. But this was a child, an innocent child who had never harmed anyone. "The queen," he said, his voice shaking, "has ordered me to kill you, to bring her your lungs and liver as proof." Snow White's face went white, whiter than usual, if that was possible. She stared at him with huge, terrified eyes. "Why? What have I done?" "Nothing," the huntsman said. "You've done nothing. But the queen..." He couldn't finish. How could he explain the queen's jealousy to a child? Snow White began to cry, not loud, theatrical crying, but quiet tears of terror and confusion. She was 7 years old, far from home, alone with a man who had just told her He was supposed to kill her. "Please," she whispered, "please don't kill me. I'll run away. I'll go into the forest and never come back. I'll never return to the castle. She'll never see me again. Please." The huntsman looked at her, and he knew he couldn't do it. He couldn't kill this child, even if it meant his own death when the queen discovered his disobedience. "Run," he said suddenly. "Run into the forest and never come back. Hide yourself. If you return to the castle, the queen will find another way to kill you. Go now, quickly, before I change my mind." Snow White didn't need to be told twice. She jumped up and ran, her cloak flying behind her, disappearing into the dense forest. The huntsman watched her go, hoping she would survive, but doubting it. A 7-year-old alone in the deep forest. What chance did she have? But he had given her a chance, at least. That was more than the queen would have done. Now he had a problem. He needed to bring the queen proof of Snow White's death, or he would pay with his own life. He couldn't bring her a child's lungs and liver. He didn't have them. And even if he could bring himself to kill Snow White, he couldn't bring himself to mutilate her body. He thought quickly. A young boar. That's what he needed. He spent the next hour hunting until he found one, killed it, and removed its lungs and liver. They were similar enough to human organs that the queen, who had probably never seen such things up close, would be fooled. He returned to the castle and presented them to the queen in a velvet-lined box. "It is done, Your Majesty," he said. "Snow White is dead." The queen took the box, opened it, and looked at the organs within. A terrible smile spread across her face. "Good," she said. "Very good. You have done well." That night, according to some versions of the tale, the queen had the organs cooked and ate them, believing she was consuming Snow White's lungs and liver. It's a horrifying detail, showing just how far her madness had progressed. Other versions simply say she was satisfied with the proof and had them buried. Either way, she believed Snow White was dead. The next morning, she stood before her mirror with a smile of triumph and asked, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all?" And the mirror answered, "You, O Queen, are the fairest of all." The queen's smile widened. Her rival was gone. She was supreme again. All was as it should be. But the mirror had not lied. It had simply told the truth as it knew it. Snow White was no longer in the kingdom, no longer visible to the mirror's magic. As far as the mirror knew, the queen was indeed the fairest. But Snow White was not dead. She was very much alive, alone and terrified in the deep forest, running for her life. Snow White ran until she couldn't run anymore. She had no idea where she was going, no plan, no supplies. She was simply fleeing, driven by pure terror and the survival instinct. The forest was terrifying to a child raised in a castle. The trees seemed to reach for her with gnarled branches. Strange sounds echoed through the darkness. The ground was uneven, covered with roots and rocks that made her stumble. Thorns tore at her dress and scratched her arms. She ran until exhaustion overtook fear. And then she collapsed against a tree, sobbing. She was lost, alone, and she had no idea what to do. She couldn't go back. The queen wanted her dead. She couldn't go forward. She didn't know where forward was. She was 7 years old, and she was going to die out here in the forest, alone. She cried until she had no tears left, and then she simply sat there, numb and despairing. But as the afternoon wore on and the shadows grew longer, something in Snow White stirred. The same survival instinct that had made her run made her realize if she stayed here, she would die. She needed shelter. She needed food. She needed to move. So she stood up, chose a direction at random, and began walking. For hours she walked, her feet aching, her dress torn, her face scratched and dirty. The forest seemed endless. Just when she thought she couldn't take another step, that she would have to lie down and accept whatever fate awaited her, she saw something through the trees. Light. Not natural light, but the warm glow of lamplight or firelight. The light of human habitation. New energy surged through her. She pushed toward it, breaking through the underbrush, and found herself in a small clearing. There, in the middle of the clearing, stood a cottage. It was small, tiny, really, but perfectly formed. Everything about it seemed miniature, from the low door to the small windows with their neat curtains. The cottage was well maintained, clean and tidy, with a small garden out front and smoke rising from the chimney. Snow White approached cautiously and knocked on the door. No answer. She knocked again, louder. Still no answer. Desperate and exhausted, she tried the latch. The door opened. "Hello?" she called out, stepping inside. "Is anyone home?" The interior of the cottage was as neat and tidy as the exterior. There was a main room with a table and chairs. 7 chairs, Snow White noticed, and a fireplace where a fire burned low. Beyond, she could see a small kitchen area and a ladder leading up to what must be a sleeping loft. But everything was small. The table came up to her waist. The chairs were sized for someone much shorter than her. Even the doorways were low. If an adult had tried to enter, they would have had to duck. "Hello?" She called again. Silence. Whoever lived here was apparently not home, but the fire was lit, and there was food on the table. 7 little plates with bread and cheese. 7 little cups with what looked like beer or cider. Everything set out as if for dinner, but no one had touched it yet. Snow White's stomach growled. She hadn't eaten since breakfast, and she was starving. Surely, she thought, whoever lived here wouldn't mind if she took just a little bit. Just enough to keep from fainting. She took a small piece of bread from one plate, a sliver of cheese from another, a sip of drink from one cup. Not enough that anyone would notice, she hoped. Just enough to ease the terrible hunger. Then, exhausted beyond measure, she climbed the ladder to the loft. There she found 7 small beds in a row, each made up with clean sheets and blankets. They were too small for her. Her feet hung off the end. But she was so tired that she didn't care. She lay down across 3 of the beds, her body spanning them, and fell instantly into a deep, exhausted sleep. The cottage belonged to 7 dwarfs who worked in a diamond mine deep in the mountains. These were not the jovial, singing dwarfs of later tales. The Brothers Grimm described them simply as 7 dwarfs who mined precious stones in the mountains and came home each evening to their neat little cottage. They worked hard, these dwarfs. They were neither wealthy nor poor, simply workers who valued order, cleanliness, and their independence. They had built their cottage themselves, had furnished it with care, and had established a routine that suited them. They returned home that evening, just as the sun was setting, carrying their tools and looking forward to their dinner. But as they approached their cottage, something seemed wrong. "The door is ajar," said the first dwarf. "And look, there's a light in the window, but we didn't leave it burning so bright," said the second. Cautiously, they entered their home, and immediately they knew someone had been there. "Someone's eaten from my plate," said the first dwarf. "Someone's drunk from my cup," said the second. "Someone's been sitting in my chair," said the third. They were alarmed, but not yet frightened. Perhaps a traveler had stumbled upon their cottage and taken some food. That was understandable, though impolite. But then the 7th dwarf climbed up to the sleeping loft to check on their beds, and he called down in surprise, "Someone is sleeping in my bed. Come and see." All 7 dwarfs climbed up to the loft, and there they found Snow White, fast asleep, sprawled across 3 of their beds. They stood in silence, staring at her. Even in sleep, with her face dirty and her dress torn, her beauty was evident. Her skin really was as white as snow, her lips as red as blood, her hair as black as ebony. "It's a child," whispered the first dwarf. "She's been injured. Look at the scratches on her arms," said the second. "Why is a child alone in the deep forest?" wondered the third. They debated quietly about what to do. They could wake her and demand to know who she was and what she was doing in their cottage. Or they could let her sleep. She was clearly exhausted, and wait until morning to ask their questions. Being kind-hearted, despite their gruff appearance, they decided to let her sleep. The 7th dwarf, whose beds she occupied, slept downstairs on the floor, taking turns with the others, who gave up their beds for an hour at a time throughout the night. When morning came, Snow White woke to find 7 pairs of eyes staring at her. She sat up with a gasp, frightened, and nearly hit her head on the low ceiling of the loft. "Don't be afraid," said the eldest dwarf, his voice gentle despite being gruff. "We won't hurt you. But you must tell us, who are you? And how did you come to be in our house?" Snow White looked at them. 7 short men with beards and kind eyes. And something in her relaxed. They didn't seem threatening. They seemed concerned. "My name is Snow White," she said. I'm a princess, or I was. My stepmother, the queen, ordered a huntsman to kill me. He took pity on me and let me go, but told me I could never return to the castle. I ran through the forest until I found your cottage. I'm sorry I came in without permission, and I'm sorry I ate your food. I was just so hungry and frightened. The dwarfs listened to her story with growing sympathy and anger. "The queen ordered a child killed?" said one. "What kind of monster is she?" "You can't go back," said another. "She'll try again if she knows you're alive." "But you can't stay in the forest alone either," said a third. "You'll die out here." They conferred quietly among themselves, and finally, the eldest dwarf turned to Snow White. "You may stay with us," he said. "We can offer you shelter and safety, but you must earn your keep. We work in the mines all day, and we need someone to keep the house, to cook and clean. Can you do that?" Snow White nodded eagerly. "Oh, yes. I can cook and clean and mend and do whatever you need. Thank you. Thank you so much." And so it was settled. Snow White would stay with the 7 dwarfs, hidden away in the deep forest, where the queen would never think to look for her. The dwarfs gave Snow White strict instructions. While we are at the mine, you must keep the door locked and let no one in. The queen is powerful and clever. If she discovers you're alive, she will find a way to reach you. Trust no one. Let no one inside. Promise us. Snow White promised solemnly. She understood the danger. For a time, months, perhaps a year, Snow White lived happily with the dwarfs. She kept the cottage spotlessly clean, cooked meals for them, mended their clothes, and in return, they protected her and treated her with kindness. She was safe, hidden, and beginning to heal from the trauma of her near-death experience. She grew older, more beautiful, and in the safety of the cottage, she began to bloom. At 8, at 9, at 10, her beauty increased until even the dwarfs, who were not given to noticing such things, remarked on it. But all this time, the queen believed Snow White was dead. And every morning, she asked her mirror, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all?" And every morning, the mirror replied, "You, O Queen, are the fairest of all." Until one day, when Snow White was 10 years old, and the mirror's magic had finally found her again, the answer changed. The queen stood before her mirror, as she did every morning. In the 3 years since Snow White's supposed death, the queen had been content. She was the fairest, unchallenged, supreme. Her beauty was praised throughout the kingdom. All was well. She asked her question with casual confidence. "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all?" The mirror's reply struck her like a physical blow. "You, O Queen, are fair. 'Tis true. But over the mountains, where the 7 dwarfs dwell, Snow White is living and well, and she is 1,000 times fairer than you." The queen stood frozen. For a moment, she couldn't process what she'd heard. Snow White? Alive? After all this time? "That's impossible," she whispered. "The huntsman brought me her lungs and liver. I saw them." But the mirror never lied, and the queen, in her heart, knew it. The huntsman had betrayed her. He had let Snow White live, and now, somewhere over the mountains, with 7 dwarfs. 7 dwarfs? What did that mean? Snow White was alive. Not only alive, but fairer than ever. The queen's rage was terrible to behold. She smashed things in her chamber, screamed until her voice was raw, and then fell into a cold, calculating fury that was even more dangerous than her hot anger. If servants couldn't be trusted to kill Snow White, then the queen would have to do it herself. But she couldn't go as the queen. She would be recognized. Snow White would be warned. The dwarfs, whoever they were, would protect her. No, she needed disguise. She needed to be someone Snow White would trust enough to let into the cottage. The queen went to her secret chamber, the room where she practiced the dark arts that few knew about. There, with potions and spells and forbidden knowledge, she began to transform herself. She aged herself, making her smooth skin wrinkled and spotted. She grayed her beautiful dark hair. She bent her straight back into a hunch. She clouded her clear eyes. She transformed her noble bearing into the shuffle of an old peasant woman. When she was done, she looked in the mirror and saw an old peddler woman staring back at her. Perfect. No one would recognize her now. She took a basket and filled it with pretty things to sell. Ribbons and combs and laces. Things a young girl might find appealing. And among these innocent items, she included one special thing. A beautiful silk lace for a bodice, a corset lace in Snow White's favorite colors. But she treated this lace with a powerful poison, not one that would kill through the skin. That would be too traceable. No, dear, this poison worked more subtly. When tied tightly, it would constrict and suffocate, making it look like a tragic accident. Satisfied with her preparations, the queen set out on her journey. She traveled over 7 mountains, a journey of several days, until she came to the region where the dwarfs lived. She asked in a village about 7 dwarfs, and the villagers directed her to a path that led deeper into the forest. Finally, she found the cottage, small and neat in its clearing. Smoke rose from the chimney. Someone was home. The queen, in her disguise as an old peddler woman, knocked on the door. Inside the cottage, Snow White was preparing dinner for the dwarfs, who would return from the mine soon. She heard the knock and froze. The dwarfs had warned her, "Let no one in." "Who is it?" she called out. "Just a poor old peddler woman," came the reply in a creaky, harmless voice. "I have pretty things to sell, ribbons and laces and combs. Won't you at least look? You don't have to buy, just look." Snow White hesitated. The dwarfs had said to let no one in, but surely an old peddler woman couldn't hurt her, and it would be nice to see some pretty things. She'd been isolated in this cottage for years now. She went to the window and looked out. There stood an old woman with a kind, wrinkled face, holding a basket of lovely things. She looked completely harmless. "I can't open the door," Snow White said, "but you can show me your wares through the window." "Of course, dear," the old woman said sweetly, and she held up various items: ribbons in different colors, combs made of horn and wood, and laces of silk. Snow White looked at them all with delight. It had been so long since she'd had anything pretty. And then the old woman held up a particular lace, a beautiful silk one in colors of crimson and gold. "This one," the old woman said, "is very special. It's made for a princess, I think, someone of great beauty. Would you like to try it?" "Oh, I couldn't," Snow White said, though her eyes lingered on the lace. It was beautiful. "Just try it," the old woman encouraged. "If it doesn't fit, or you don't like it, you don't have to buy it. But let me lace you up properly. I'm very good at it. I've been lacing ladies into their bodices for 50 years. And because Snow White was only 10 years old, because she was innocent and trusting, and because the old woman seemed so kind and harmless, she unlocked the door. The old woman came in, her eyes taking in every detail of the cottage with barely concealed triumph. Snow White stood before her, and the old woman took the old laces out of her bodice and replaced them with the new, beautiful silk ones. "There," the old woman said, "now I'll lace you up nice and tight, the way proper young ladies should be laced." And she pulled and pulled and pulled the laces tighter and tighter until Snow White couldn't breathe. The girl gasped, tried to speak, tried to pull away, but the old woman was surprisingly strong. She pulled until Snow White's eyes rolled back, until the girl collapsed to the floor, apparently lifeless. The queen stepped back, dropped the old woman's demeanor, and looked down at Snow White with satisfaction. "Not so fair now, are you?" she said coldly. "Let's see if the mirror changes its answer now." She left the cottage, pulling the door closed behind her, and began her journey back to the castle. When the 7 dwarfs returned home that evening, they found Snow White collapsed on the floor, her face blue, apparently dead. They were devastated. They gathered around her, weeping, calling her name. But then one of them noticed how tightly the new laces were pulled. "Look! Someone has laced her too tight. She's suffocating." Quickly, they cut the laces with a knife. Immediately, Snow White gasped and began to breathe again. Color returned to her face. Her eyes fluttered open. "What happened?" one of the dwarfs demanded. "Who was here?" Snow White, still weak, told them about the old peddler woman and the beautiful laces. "That was no peddler woman," the eldest dwarf said angrily. "That was the queen in disguise. You let her in, even though we warned you." Snow White wept. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. She seemed so harmless." "The queen will try again," another dwarf said. "Next time, You must not open the door for anyone at all. Do you understand? Not a kind old woman, not a lost child, not anyone. Promise us. Snow White promised, tears streaming down her face. She had been so foolish. The dwarf stayed with her that night, comforting her. And in the morning, they went to the mine with great reluctance, making Snow White promise again and again that she would not open the door. Meanwhile, the queen had returned to her castle, confident that Snow White was finally dead. She immediately went to her mirror and asked, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all?" And the mirror replied, "You, O Queen, are fair, 'tis true. But over the mountains, where the 7 dwarfs dwell, Snow White is living and well, and she is 1,000 times fairer than you." The queen's scream of rage echoed through the castle. Still alive. How was she still alive? This time, the queen would not fail. The queen returned to her secret chamber and began to prepare again. She created a new disguise, this time an entirely different old woman, with different features and a different voice. She couldn't risk Snow White recognizing her from before. And this time, she created a different weapon. She took a beautiful comb, carved from dark wood and decorated with intricate designs, and she poisoned it. This poison was more deadly. If it touched the scalp, it would seep into the blood and kill within minutes. She disguised herself once more and made the journey over the 7 mountains to the dwarf's cottage. When she arrived, she knocked on the door. Inside, Snow White heard the knock and felt her heart race with fear. "Who is it?" she called, not going near the door. "A peddler woman," came the reply. A different voice than last time, but still old and seemingly harmless. "I have beautiful combs to sell. Won't you look?" "Go away," Snow White said, remembering her promise. "I'm not allowed to let anyone in." "You don't have to let me in, dear," the woman said reasonably. "Just come to the window and look. No harm in looking, is there?" Snow White hesitated. The dwarfs had said not to open the door. They hadn't said anything about looking through the window, and she desperately wanted to see another human face, to have a moment of connection with someone other than the dwarfs. She went to the window, but kept it closed. Through the glass, she could see an old woman who looked nothing like the peddler from before. This one had a kind, grandmotherly face. The woman held up various combs, each more beautiful than the last. And then she showed Snow White a particularly gorgeous one, dark wood, carved with flowers and vines, polished to a shine. "This one," the old woman said, "was made for royalty. It's fit for a princess. "Oh, but your hair is so beautiful. May I just show you how it would look? I won't come in. Just open the window a bit and lean out, and I'll place it in your hair so you can see how lovely it is." Snow White knew she shouldn't, but the comb was so beautiful, and the old woman was on the outside, and she couldn't come in through a window, could she? What harm could there be in just looking? She opened the window and leaned out. The old woman smiled, a cold, terrible smile, and quick as a snake, she stuck the comb deep into Snow White's hair, against her scalp. The poison worked instantly. Snow White's eyes went wide. Her mouth opened in a silent gap, and she collapsed forward, hanging halfway out the window. The queen pulled the comb out just enough to let Snow White slide backward into the cottage. Then she turned and hurried away. When the 7 dwarfs returned that evening, they found Snow White collapsed by the window. At first, they thought she was dead, and their grief was terrible. But then one of them noticed the beautiful comb still caught in her hair. "Another trick! Look, a poisoned comb!" They pulled it from her hair, and immediately Snow White began to revive. She coughed, gasped, and opened her eyes. "Again?" one of the dwarfs said, his voice a mixture of relief and anger. "You opened the window for her?" Snow White wept with shame and terror. "I didn't open the door. You said not to open the door. I thought the window—" "The queen is clever," the eldest dwarf said grimly. "She will find any opening, any weakness. Next time, and there will be a next time, you must not go near the door or the windows. You must not speak to anyone. Do you understand? Anyone at all." Snow White nodded, too shaken to speak. The queen, once again confident of her success, returned to her castle and asked her mirror the fateful question. And once again, the mirror told her that Snow White lived and was fairer than she. This time, the queen did not scream. She grew very still, very cold. Her face became a mask of determination. "Third time," she whispered, "will be the charm." The queen locked herself in her secret chamber for 3 days. She poured all her knowledge of dark magic, all her skill with poisons, into creating the perfect murder weapon, an apple. But not just any apple. This apple was a masterpiece of deception. She took the most beautiful apple she could find, large, perfect, with skin of red and white. The red side she left pure and untouched. The white side she injected with the most powerful poison she knew. This poison was special. It would not kill immediately, but would put the victim into a death-like sleep. A sleep so deep that they would appear dead by every measure. No breath, no heartbeat, no warmth. The victim would seem dead, would be buried as dead, but would actually be in a state of suspended animation. And unless the piece of poisoned apple was removed from the throat, the victim would never wake. It was, in many ways, crueler than outright death. But the queen wanted Snow White to suffer. She wanted her to be buried alive, to be placed in a tomb while still technically conscious on some deep level, trapped forever in darkness. She admired her work. The apple looked innocent, even wholesome. No one would suspect that half of it carried death. For this attempt, the queen created a new disguise. Not an old woman this time. Snow White had learned to fear old women. No, this time she disguised herself as a young peasant woman, rosy-cheeked and friendly, carrying a basket of apples like a farmer's daughter selling her harvest. Once more, she made the journey over the 7 mountains. Once more, she approached the cottage, and once more, she knocked on the door. "Who is it?" Snow White called from deep inside the cottage, not approaching the door. "Just a farmer's daughter?" came a young, cheerful voice. "I'm selling apples from my father's orchard, the finest apples in the land. Would you like to buy some?" "No, thank you," Snow White called back. "Go away, please. I'm not allowed to open the door or even go near the windows." "That's all right," the girl's voice said. "I understand. But could you at least come to the door to talk? I'm so lonely. I've been walking all day and haven't spoken to anyone. You don't have to open it. Just talk to me through the door." Snow White hesitated. Just talking through a closed door seemed safe enough. The dwarfs hadn't forbidden her from talking, just from opening doors and windows. She approached the door, but kept it firmly closed. "I'm here," she said, "but I can't open the door." "That's fine," the young woman said kindly. "You're very cautious. That's wise. I wish I had an apple to give you, though. They're so sweet and juicy. But I understand you can't take anything from strangers." "I'm sorry," Snow White said, and she genuinely was. She could hear the disappointment in the other girl's voice, and Snow White's kind nature made her want to please. "Tell you what," the young woman said. "I'll cut this apple in half. See, I'm eating the white half myself." There was the sound of crunching, of eating. Delicious. "And I'll leave the red half here by your door. If you want it, you can get it after I leave. That way, you'll know it's safe. I ate from the same apple." Snow White heard footsteps walking away. She waited several minutes, then carefully opened the door, just a crack, and peered out. No one was there, but sitting on the doorstep was half an apple, the red half, looking perfect and delicious. And on the ground nearby, she could see the white half with bite marks where the young woman had eaten from it. If she ate from the same apple, Snow White thought, then it must be safe. She tested it on the same apple. How could half an apple be poisoned if someone just ate from the other half? She picked up the red half and looked at it. It looked so good. She hadn't had fresh fruit in so long, and the young woman had eaten from it. It was safe. She took a bite. The piece of apple stuck in her throat. Immediately, the poison took effect. Snow White fell to the ground as if struck by lightning. The apple piece lodged in her throat, her heart stopping, her breath ceasing, every sign of life vanishing. She lay on the ground, looking for all the world like a beautiful corpse. The queen, who had been watching from behind a tree, stepped out and looked down at Snow White. Finally, it was done. "Mirror that all you like," she said to the still form, and she laughed, a sound like breaking glass, before hurrying away. When the 7 dwarfs returned that evening, they found Snow White lying dead on the doorstep. The door was open. An apple lay nearby. They tried everything. They cut laces that weren't there. They searched her hair for poisoned combs. They splashed her with water, rubbed her limbs, spoke to her, begged her to wake. But Snow White did not wake. She did not breathe. Her heart did not beat. By every measure they knew, she was dead. The dwarfs wept. They had tried so hard to protect her, and they had failed. For 3 days, they kept vigil by her body, unable to accept that she was truly gone. But she never changed, didn't stiffen as corpses do, didn't decay, didn't lose her color. She looked as though she were simply sleeping, but she was cold as ice and still as death. "We cannot bury her," the eldest dwarf said finally. "We cannot put her in the dark earth. She's too beautiful. It seems wrong." So they made her a coffin, but not an ordinary one. They made it from glass, transparent on all sides, so that she could still be seen. They dressed her in her finest clothes, laid her gently inside, and wrote on the coffin in gold letters, "Princess Snow White." They carried the glass coffin to a mountaintop with a beautiful view of the valleys and forests below. There they set it in a place of honor, and they took turns keeping watch over it, day and night, so that Snow White would never be alone. Time passed. Seasons changed. Snow White lay in her glass coffin, unchanged, as beautiful as the day she had fallen. The dwarfs grew older, their beards graying, but they never abandoned their vigil. And then, one day, a prince came riding through those mountains. He was young, this prince, perhaps 18 or 19, and he was on a hunting trip with his companions. They had ventured far from his father's kingdom and were exploring these remote mountains when they saw something impossible: a glass coffin on a mountaintop, and inside it, a girl so beautiful that even from a distance, she took his breath away. He rode closer, his companions following, and dismounted near the coffin. One of the 7 dwarfs, the youngest one, was on watch that day. "What is this?" the prince asked, unable to take his eyes from Snow White. "Who is she?" "Princess Snow White," the dwarf said sadly. "She lived with us for years, hiding from her wicked stepmother. But the stepmother found her and poisoned her. We couldn't bear to bury her, so we keep her here, where she can see the sun and stars." The prince approached the glass coffin and looked down at Snow White. Even in death, even cold and still, she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. Her skin was white as snow. Her lips were red as blood. Her hair was black as ebony. And something happened to the prince in that moment. Something irrational and impossible to explain. He fell in love with the dead girl in the glass coffin. "Let me have her," he said suddenly. "Let me take her back to my kingdom. I'll build a tomb for her in my castle, and I'll visit her every day. I'll honor her memory. Please." The dwarf shook his head. "We cannot part with her. She is ours to protect, even in death." "I'll pay you," the prince said desperately. "Gold, jewels, whatever you want. Please, I cannot leave her here." "We do not want your gold," the dwarf said. "She is not for sale." The prince fell to his knees. "Then I am begging you. As one man to another, I am begging. Let me take her. Let me care for her. I swear, I will honor her. I swear she will be treated with the utmost respect. Please." I cannot explain it, but I feel as though I cannot live if I leave her here. The dwarf looked at this young prince, saw the genuine anguish in his face, and felt something soften in his heart. The other dwarfs came up from the cottage, called by the commotion, and they conferred. "Very well," the eldest dwarf said finally. "You may take her, but you must promise she must never be alone. She must be honored. And if we hear that you have mistreated her memory, we will come for her, and we will come for you." "I promise," the prince said solemnly. "With all my heart, I promise." So the prince's servants carefully lifted the glass coffin and began to carry it down the mountain toward where the prince's horse and wagons waited. The prince walked beside it, never taking his eyes from Snow White's face. But the path down the mountain was rough. One of the servants stumbled over a root, and the coffin jerked violently. And in that moment, the piece of poisoned apple that had been lodged in Snow White's throat for so long was dislodged. She coughed. The servants nearly dropped the coffin in shock. The prince rushed forward. Snow White's eyes opened. She gasped, coughed again, and the piece of apple flew from her mouth. Color flooded back into her cheeks. Her heart began to beat. She was alive. "What? Where am I?" she said, sitting up in confusion. "What happened?" The prince was speechless. The dwarf, who had followed them down the mountain, began to laugh and cry at the same time. "You're alive!" he shouted. "Princess Snow White! You're alive!" And then the prince found his voice. "You're alive," he whispered, and it came out like a prayer. "You're really alive." Snow White looked at him, at this handsome young prince who was looking at her as though she were the answer to every question he'd ever asked. "Who are you?" she asked. "I am Prince. I am..." He couldn't seem to remember his own name. "I am someone who has been waiting his whole life to meet you, though I didn't know it until today." Snow White's awakening was a miracle, and word of it spread quickly. The 7 dwarfs came running down the mountain and were overjoyed to find her alive and well. She thanked them for all they had done, for the years they had cared for her and protected her, and she promised she would never forget them. The prince took Snow White to his father's castle, where the king and queen welcomed her warmly. The prince's parents could see that their son had fallen deeply in love with this girl from the glass coffin. And Snow White, grateful for his gentleness and kind heart, found herself falling in love with him in return. It was decided they would marry. Invitations were sent throughout the land. A grand wedding was planned. Kings and queens from neighboring kingdoms were invited, including Snow White's stepmother. The evil queen, who had believed Snow White dead for years, received an invitation to Prince Name's wedding to a Princess Snow White. She assumed it must be a different Snow White. Her stepdaughter was dead, after all. She had asked her mirror many times since the poisoned apple, and each time the mirror had replied that she, the queen, was the fairest of all. But on the morning of the wedding, the queen stood before her mirror and asked one final time, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all?" And the mirror replied, "You, O queen, were fairest here, but the young queen is 1,000 times more fair. The queen's blood ran cold. What young queen? The one who weds today, Snow White, whose beauty is beyond compare. She whom you tried to kill, but who has returned from death itself. She is the fairest of all. The queen stood frozen, Snow White, alive, marrying a prince, becoming a queen herself. The queen should have fled. She should have run far away, changed her identity, hidden herself. But rage and curiosity warred within her, and curiosity won. She had to see. She had to know if it was really her stepdaughter. So she dressed in her finest gown and traveled to the wedding. When she arrived at the castle and was announced, she entered the great hall where the wedding feast was being held. She saw the happy couple, the handsome prince and his bride. And the bride was Snow White, older now. She was 15 or 16, no longer the child she had been, but unmistakably Snow White, with her white skin and red lips and black hair, more beautiful than ever. Snow White looked across the hall and saw her stepmother. Their eyes met. For a moment, neither moved. Then Snow White rose from her seat, and the queen saw in the girl's eyes not forgiveness, but justice. "Guards," Snow White said, her voice clear and calm. "Seize that woman. She is guilty of attempted murder, of ordering my death when I was 7 years old, and trying 3 more times to kill me herself." The queen tried to run, but the guards were faster. They seized her and brought her before Snow White. "You tried to kill me," Snow White said, looking down at the woman who had once been queen. "Out of vanity, out of jealousy, because you could not bear that someone else might be more beautiful. You killed my father. Oh yes, I found out about that too. You poisoned him slowly over years. You destroyed everything you touched." The queen spat at her. "You took everything from me. You stole my position as the fairest." "Beauty," Snow White said quietly, "is not something one owns. It is not a position to be held. And you were willing to kill for it. That makes you a monster." Sentence was passed. In some versions of the tale, the queen was simply exiled. In others, she was imprisoned for life. But in the Brothers Grimm's original version, the punishment was darker and more poetic. Iron shoes had been placed in the fire until they were red hot. The queen was forced to put them on and dance until she fell down dead. It was a cruel punishment, but for attempted infanticide, for multiple murder attempts, for regicide, for all the evil she had done, the kingdom judged that she deserved no less. Snow White watched without emotion as the sentence was carried out. She did not smile. She took no joy in her stepmother's suffering, but neither did she weep or ask for mercy. Some crimes, she had learned, are too great for mercy. When it was over, Snow White returned to her wedding feast, and she danced with her prince until the stars came out. Snow White and her prince were married, and in the way of fairy tales, they lived happily ever after. But what does that really mean? Snow White had been through more trauma by age 15 than most people experience in a lifetime. She had been targeted for murder at age 7. She had lived in constant fear for years. She had been killed, or very nearly so, 3 times. She had lain in a glass coffin for months or years, in a state between life and death. Did she really just live happily ever after, with no nightmares, no fears, no scars? The fairy tale doesn't tell us. It ends with the wedding, with the evil punished and the good rewarded. But life is more complicated than that. Perhaps Snow White had nightmares. Perhaps she flinched when people offered her food. Perhaps she could never quite trust beautiful things, knowing that poison could hide beneath an appealing surface. Perhaps she looked in mirrors and felt complicated things, gratitude for her beauty, which had brought her a prince and a kingdom, but also resentment for it, knowing that her beauty had made her a target, had nearly cost her life. Perhaps she thought often of the 7 dwarfs who had saved her, who had kept her alive and safe for years. Perhaps she visited them often, making the journey over the 7 mountains. And perhaps they became advisors in her court, honored for their kindness. Perhaps she learned from her stepmother's example what not to be. Perhaps she looked at her own beauty in the mirror and remembered that beauty is fleeting, that it is not the measure of worth, that kindness and goodness matter more than fairness of face. Perhaps when she had daughters of her own, she taught them to be cautious, but not paranoid, to be kind, but not naive, to trust, but to verify that trust. Perhaps she outlawed magic mirrors in her kingdom. Perhaps she had the hunting forests thinned and patrolled, so that no other lost child would wander alone and terrified as she once had. Perhaps she had her stepmother's secret chambers sealed, all the dark magic locked away where no one could use it again. Perhaps she was happy, not perfectly, not without scars, but happy in the way that people who have survived terrible things can be happy, grateful for each day, cherishing what they have, knowing how quickly it can be lost. And perhaps, just perhaps, That's what happily ever after really means. Not perfection, not absence of pain, but survival, growth. The choice to be kind even after cruelty. The choice to trust even after betrayal. The choice to live fully even after nearly dying. Snow White chose to live. And that, more than any magic mirror or glass coffin or handsome prince, is what makes her story worth telling. And so we come to the end of Snow White's tale. The girl with skin white as snow, lips red as blood, and hair black as ebony. The girl whose beauty was both blessing and curse. The girl who survived 3 murder attempts and death itself. Think about this story as you drift off to sleep. Think about what it really means. On the surface, it's a simple tale. Beautiful girl, evil stepmother, 7 dwarfs, poison apple, handsome prince. But beneath that surface, there are deeper truths. It's a story about how vanity can corrupt into madness. The queen was beautiful, but her beauty was never enough because it wasn't supreme. She needed to be the fairest, the best, the most. And when that was threatened, she was willing to kill. How many people do we know who define themselves by one thing? Beauty, wealth, intelligence, success, and become monsters when that one thing is threatened? How many people can't bear to be second best? It's a story about how beauty can be dangerous. Snow White did nothing wrong except be beautiful. She was kind, gentle, innocent. But her beauty made her a target. It nearly killed her multiple times. We still live in a world where beauty can be dangerous, where being attractive can make you a target, where people are judged, valued, or devalued based on their appearance. Snow White's story reminds us of that uncomfortable truth. It's a story about trust and betrayal. Snow White was warned repeatedly not to trust strangers. But her kind nature made her want to believe in people. She wanted to see the good in them, and that nearly killed her. There's a lesson there, but it's not never trust anyone. It's more subtle. Trust, but be cautious. Be kind, but protect yourself. See the good in people, but remember that some people will exploit that goodness. It's a story about survival. Snow White didn't save herself through physical strength. She survived through resilience, through the kindness of others, through luck and timing. She survived because she kept going, kept trying, kept living. And in the end, she chose not to become what her stepmother was. She could have become bitter, cruel, paranoid. Instead, She chose kindness. She chose to trust her prince. She chose to let the dwarfs go back to their mine rather than forcing them to stay and serve her. She chose to be merciful to most people, reserving her justice only for those who truly deserved it. That's the real victory in this story. Not that she got the prince or the kingdom, but that she went through hell and came out the other side, still herself, still kind, still able to love. The magic mirror said Snow White was the fairest of all. But her true beauty wasn't in her white skin or red lips or black hair. It was in her resilient, forgiving, loving heart. That's a beauty that no poison can touch, a beauty that no glass coffin can contain, a beauty that no amount of jealousy can destroy. As you drift off to sleep, remember Snow White's story. Remember that being beautiful, inside or outside, can be dangerous in this world. But also remember that survival is possible, that kindness can persist even after cruelty, that love can bloom even in poisoned ground. Sleep now. Dream of glass coffins opening, of poisoned apples expelled, of cold hearts learning to beat again. Dream of snow and blood and ebony wood, and a girl who was fairer than them all, not just in face, but in spirit. And remember, mirrors can tell you how you look, but only you can tell you who you are. Good night. Thank you for journeying through Snow White's tale with me tonight. If this story moved you, leave a comment. What does fairest of all really mean? Is it beauty, kindness, strength, or something else?